Okay, well, welcome to a special edition of Naturespace with Haith entitled Budgie Brilliant. So Naturespace is the podcast that brings the wonders of nature right to your ears. And today we're chirping into the vibrant world of budgerigars, or as many of us affectionately call them, budgies. So I'm your host, Simon King, and joining us are two luminaries in the avian care and breeding world. We have the esteemed veterinary guru, Professor John E. whose expertise spans all creatures great and small, with a particular soft spot for our feathered friends. And alongside him, we're thrilled to have champion budgie breeder Snell, whose birds have flown above the rest for almost 60 years.
Correct.
Gaining a global following for their beauty and vigor. And today we'll be fluttering through a nest of topics, from the basics of what budgies are to the complexities of their care, breeding ethics, and their significant impact on our lives and the environment. So there we go. That's the agenda. Lots to do. Let's spread our wings and dive in. So welcome, gentlemen, to Naturespace with Haith.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris, let's start with you if we can. You know, your journey to becoming a champion budgie breeder and gaining a global following is inspirational. So can you share with our listeners the path you took to reach these heights, please?
Well, I started very young. I was 10 years old when I started in 1965. I'm giving away my age, John, already.
Yeah, I hadn't realised you were so young.
Thank you. But I started on my 10th birthday. My father used to keep birds for my elder brother, and he got courting, and my father's working away. The pet birds went, and 10th birthday, what do you want for your birthday, son? How about some budgies, Dad? He was at that time working in Grimsby, where we lived, and the rest is history. So we started with an aviary full, about 20 birds we bought for about £6 each, old money. And the funny story is that one of the birds had brown wings. So I looked in the book, which Dad gave me, and a brown-winged bird was a cinnamon. Little did I know, it was a lutino with creosote on. So this is how little I knew about keeping budgerigars. And soon we went on to exhibition birds. And then we just had that knack of breeding good birds. It was probably the management and I'm just not saying it because Haith's are doing this podcast, but it was Haith's seed, which was a very important part of our birds' upbringing. And it was the best seed available then. And I firmly believe it still is the best seed. So let's get past that being nice to Haith's. And
that's what they told us to say, though, wasn't
it? Yes,
it?
they did, yes. And then gradually we went through the sections, the beginner, novice, intermediate, and champion. And in 1984, the 3rd of November, one of the happiest days of my life. It wasn't when my oldest child was born. It wasn't when I got married. It was when I got best in show at the World Budgerigar Show, which was held in Doncaster Racecourse. Wonderful. With a light green hen.
Is that why we had a bodyguard when we were driven from your house this morning?
It could have been.
Because of your faith. Yeah.
Well, I don't think so, but you might be right, John. So, and that's when my life changed dramatically. As I say, it was the happiest day of my life. And I hope my wife's not listening to this, but it really was the happiest day of my life. And from then on, before then, I became a judge in 1982. Budgerigar Society official judge, and since then I've judged all over the world, lectured, judged in lots and lots of countries, and budgerigar breeding is my life, not a part of my life, it is my life.
That's interesting. Could you see a life, or could you envision a life without budgies?
Absolutely not. In fact, this morning I was talking to John over breakfast, 2 sausages, wasn't it, John?
That's right.
And I said, I don't know, I'm retired now, I'm 69 in June, what I would do without my birds.
No. And that was obvious, and it's relevant to this topic. When we went out, I'd been, of course, to your aviaries before, and Margaret came out who hadn't, and she was enthralled by how much those birds meant to you. Individual birds, the chattering of them, seeing them in flight, the youngsters in the nest boxes, you know, it's part of your soul, I think.
Well, they're part of the family,
Yeah.
And yeah. I look at my birds as the other family I have, 4 children, but these are part of my family and I care for them.
And you're a great-great-great-grandfather of the budgies, aren't you?
It's about 50 greats.
And I'm trying to say budgie when I can because it's such a lovely pronunciation, but I don't want people to think I'm being pseudo.
Well, let's remember this is podcast has been listened to really all over the world, and that's your international. You're internationally renowned, Chris, it's fair to say, as a budgie breeder, and you go overseas quite regularly to give talks.
Yes, talks and judging. And recently I was in Italy last year. I've been to Pakistan 3 times, Bahrain. I'm trying to work through the countries then. Spain,
Antarctica? Were you looking at budgies in the Antarctica?
No, I wasn't, John. No. That was a holiday. Spain, Belgium, nearly every country in Europe. South Africa, Romania, I know they're in Europe, and the States.
Okay. Well, look, we'll come back and we'll unpack a lot more about Chris Snell, the budgie keeper and breeder. But it's fair to say, Chris, there's a lot of you know a lot about the art of keeping budgies. Obviously, clearly dedicated, but you're very interested in the science behind that as well.
Yes.
And I think that's where John comes in, really, isn't it? So, John, if we can, your reputation as a vet, willing to tackle the health and well-being of just about any animal, perhaps you can explain why I say just about any, or probably any animal rather than just about, but including specifically budgerigars is procedure. So what's been the key to your success in gaining this recognition in your field?
Well, before I answer that, could I say that you mentioned that Chris and his colleagues are keen to learn more about the science of budgerigar keeping. I equally am keen to learn more about the art of it. It's a combination. And just going into Chris's aviaries this morning, the way he handled them, the way his voice dropped, the way he approached the aviaries, the way he sifted through food and so on. These are all part of the art which you acquire through experience and having a feel for the birds. But the answer to your question, you're kind enough to say all creatures great and small, is I suppose I'm a vet very much in the James Herriot tradition. But it started not because of being a vet, it was because I was a naturalist as a schoolboy, post-war years, going out in the hedgerows looking for creatures, finding a slow worm and keeping it, identifying butterflies, etc., etc. And I was lucky at that time because on the radio and later on the television, there were great naturalists like Peter Scott, later Sir Peter Scott, Maxwell Knight, a mentor of mine, James Fisher, and many others. And these had a wonderful effect on us. We would listen to these programs and then go out and delve in the countryside or keep animals. And we have to remember those great naturalists believed you didn't just go and look at them in the wild. You could nurse a sick one, perhaps. You could keep legally an animal in captivity and then build up the sort of rapport that we've seen this morning in Chris's aviaries. So initially I thought to myself, and I said to my parents, showing off, of course, I think I want to be a medical entomologist and go to the tropics with a big butterfly net and catch exotic creatures, etc., etc. My father, who was very sensible, and none of my family had been to university, said, John, if you train as a veterinary surgeon, you can still go and do these things, and if necessary, come back to Britain, put your plate up and earn an honest, and I hope mine would be an honest penny. So that's the background. So I trained as a veterinary surgeon, then decided, because Margaret, my wife, and I have lived in the tropics, that it would be best to specialise in something, because you're not wanted overseas if you're just a standard vet. You've got to have something different. So I did training in zoological medicine and veterinary pathology. So I now say I'm a wildlife veterinary pathologist, but I'm a vet at heart. And that's the background. I think any acclamation I've got is only because I talk a lot, we write a lot, and we do like interacting with people.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think that sets the tone. We know who we're talking to, and hopefully for our listeners, you now know the level of experience we're talking about. So combined, we've got Chris's nearly 60 years of budgie breeding and budgie keeping, and as John says quite rightly, very much the art behind the science of keeping birds. And then we've got John Cooper, who spent his lifetime, almost his lifetime, really, as either an amateur naturalist or, and now I mean, John, you're a veterinary pathologist, so a specialist, really, rather than a generalist. And yet, your interest, as you say, there is no animal that you wouldn't be interested in trying to help.
Absolutely, everything from tarantula spiders to gorillas and so on. And could I say the term pathologist for your listeners doesn't just mean you deal with dead things. A pathologist is interested in the cause of disease. I'm holding up now some feathers, some bird feathers that have some abnormal lesions on them, some changes in them that we call fret marks, and Chris will be familiar with these. These are from live birds, and as a pathologist, I look at the feathers from the live bird. I do electron micrograph pictures, and I've got one in my hand here, and try and find out exactly what is going on and what caused that. And so the pathologist here is learning about the cause of this particular disease, and hopefully learning sufficient to apply it to live birds, and indeed to those who look after them.
So on that point of learning, how is that information then taken from you as a pathologist once you've found these whatever the symptoms have been or the cause of death? How is that information then shared with the wider public?
Yeah, well, I think at two levels, and I've done this over the years with many species of cage and aviary bird, not just budgerigars, is first of all, you put it out to the fancy. They're the people who keep these birds, whether they're foreign finches or whatever, British finches or canaries, etc. And you say, I think I've discovered the cause, or one of the causes of this, or French molt, which we might come on to later, which baby young budgies get. And then you talk to them, because you could have got it wrong. You know, if you're a bit of a boffin, you think you've got it right, and then someone like Chris, who's down to earth, says, no, you didn't do it right. So before you publish anything, you talk to the people. Indeed, I would have discussed it with them before the project, particularly since many of my projects are done with the help of students. They want to get on for their careers, but students being students might cut the odd corner. So that's the first thing. And then the second stage of that, Simon, is putting it into a scientific publication. Because unless something is in the literature, as you know very well from your fellowship of the Linnean Society, unless something is published in the scientific literature and has been peer reviewed, people have looked at it and said, has Cooper got it right, or Cooper and his colleagues, it counts for nothing. And so papers, I've been fortunate enough to produce a lot of papers, and we alluded to them yesterday, and some, of course, are updated by new knowledge, but the scientific papers tell the scientific community, but at the same time it is so vital to keep the fanciers, the bird keepers, the reptile keepers, the ferret keepers, I don't care what it is, the people who keep the animals need to know there's some feedback.
That's so, this is interesting. So one thing I think Naturespace with Haith can be valuable for here is making sure that bird keepers and people who are interested in generally interested in bird health can access and listen to people like your good selves, and we've had other Chris Packham, Yola Williams, Paul Rose, explorer who was in charge of the Rothera Antarctic Station, which was a fascinating podcast back. Do you have access, Chris? I'm interested whether you as a bird keeper know how to access that information that John's just mentioned.
Well, the simple answer is no, we don't.
Right.
This is one thing we discussed, John. That is, last night we had a meeting with my society, Lincolnshire Budgie Society, and we was talking about where can we get this information from? Because the normal budgerigar breeders like me, we know what to do. We know when things are wrong, but we don't know that last little bit, how to put it right. And we are sometimes treading water. I've had sort of nearly 60 years, and that's a weak spot of mine. And I would think a lot of the budgerigar breeders that we don't know that last little bit.
So sorry, Chris. Obviously, we've got John in the room, and John's probably taller than both of us, but he's well fed, so I don't think he'll spring from his chair. What's your relationship like with John aside with vets?
Well, I look at it when I talk to John. He's my missing link.
Right.
And I think
that's been said before, actually.
Because I walk on four legs, not two.
I said the missing link to be a better budgerigar breeder. And also, I think my knowledge is useful to John. So
exactly,
we come from different angles, and we hit in the middle. And sometimes we look at each other and think, oh, that's a special moment, Yesterday, John, I brought some samples of, I say my droppings, but I should say my bird's droppings.
I don't mind, I look at anything.
And he put them under the microscope, and he said to me, oh, your birds are healthy.
Right.
Which was I really made my day, that did, because I was a bit concerned that you're going to find something.
Well, I was hoping to find some worms wriggling there and so on. And lo and behold, it was the chairman of the Budgerigar Society, and nothing except normal urates, that's the white part of the droppings, and normal feces, which is the darker part. Yeah.
So there is a disconnect then. There's information that's been written and peer reviewed.
Yes.
But that scientific information isn't necessarily finding its way into the hands of
it isn't
the breeders.
Now, I'm talking to John. I talked to him this morning that if we could have somewhere where that information is, because John's an intelligent guy, I'm an intelligent guy, but we're intelligent on different things, and we got to put the two together. If John could come up with something we can read and understand, that would be a fantastic for my hobby.
Right.
Really would.
Okay.
I think it's worth putting on record, Simon, that actually the Budgerigar Society has a commendable record of collaboration between vets, avian scientists, nutritionists, people who've worked with you here at Haith, etc., and the fancy. I mean, I'm holding up here, for example, a little booklet. It's by the Budgerigar Society, First Aid for Budgerigars. It's a complimentary copy I got because I played a part in it. It was produced about 30 years ago. And Dr. John Baker, who was then a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool, who kept birds and knew all the fancy, and not just budgerigars, he put this together. He was the go-between. He was the veterinary advisor to the Budgerigar Society, and he was the go-between. So when points came up, if he wrote a scientific paper, if John Cooper did, someone else, he would, and I mean this very politely, translate it to your members into, well, what Cooper's saying here, forget all the scientific jargon, is that your birds would do better if they had more protein, less protein in their diet, whatever. Now, those days, unfortunately, I hold it up here with sadness, this little booklet. This is First Aid for Budgerigars. John Baker is very, very retired, even older than I am. And we haven't got that sort of link at the moment. And I think one part of this getting us together has to be, and perhaps, Simon, this podcast could be promoted with your permission to veterinary schools, to wildlife societies like the Cambridge one, which you've supported in the past, and say your members ought to listen to this, and some up-and-coming young vets and avian biologists ought to work with the Budgerigar Society, and they'll both learn from it.
Yes.
So, it doesn't have to be scientific papers, although I could provide lots of those, but some of your members, you had some erudite people there last night, but some of your members would say, oh, this is just scientific nonsense. They want to know the significance. If I talk about cytosine beak and feather disease and then start talking about circoviruses, their eyes glaze over.
Like mine are now. Yes.
Well, look, before that happened,
he had a late night, that's why.
Well, if yours are, Chris, then some of our listeners will be as well. So let's move on.
Yes.
But suffice to say, there seems to be a little bit of a gap in between this art and science. And if we want it to blend better for the sake of better bird health, we need to find a way of bridging that gap. Some of the information and research is already available, but if it's not filtering its way through to the breeders and keepers, then it's not finding its audience really. So perhaps this is where technology might come in. Then we can think about this. We'll come back to our listeners, and maybe we'll something we'll work on jointly.
And could I suggest that even before we get to that happy stage, the other thing that the members of us call it BS, then I don't have to say Budgerigar or Budgerigar, the BS, the Budgerigar Society could do, is encourage members who are keen on this sort of thing, first of all, to keep records. We talked about records this morning. But for example, if I may say, I'm holding here an egg of a budgerigar from this morning. We went round your aviaries, Chris, and you very kindly showed us some nest boxes. Margaret, my wife, loved it, and so do I, of course. And there were a couple of eggs there that you thought probably were not going to hatch, dead in shell as they're called. I brought one in, not because I necessarily want to do anything with it myself, but it is possible that some of these student societies who can get little grants from their college or whatever might say to your members, if you can send us some eggs, or even the egg shells for us to weigh, to measure, to get calcium levels done, etc. We can do a little project, and you, the BS, can get some feedback. So I think the science starts from both sides.
That would be
your wish to learn and the fact you've got the material. Why does John Cooper pick up this egg? I've looked at hundreds of budgerigar eggs in the past, but this came from you, and you were kind enough to be open and say, take it if you'd like it.
Okay, brilliant. Let's move on. Let's move on to our topics to explore. And I think the first one should be the simplest thing. It's kind of agreeing what a budgie is. Podcast is called Budgie Brilliant. So what are budgies? What are budgerigars? Why are they significant? And why are they brilliant? Why is it brilliant to keep them?
Ask Chris, he's biased. We heard that earlier.
They're just a wonderful bird, and I'll tell you a little story. One of my daughters got engaged and the boyfriend's grandmother was there, Janice. So if you ever look on my Facebook and find Janice with Sydney. Now, Sydney is a dominant pied I gave to Janice, and this bird actually talks, sings. Apparently it sings one of the Killers records. I've never heard of the Killers, but they're quite a popular group. And it sings.
The chairman will know. Simon knows all these things. Yeah.
And this bird, Janice had lost her husband a few years ago, and this bird is actually the best thing anybody could have. So everybody used to have pet birds when I was younger, and that's gone. But I sometimes give my lesser birds away for pets, and it's like it makes people very happy.
Right. So we're talking about breeding and bird keeping, but you're an advocate of budgies being kept as pets as well,
yes,
really.
Yes.
So can we keep one budgie? I think we've talked about this before, but
yes, if you want a bird to talk, you've got to have one budgie, and ideally a cock bird at 6 weeks old. And what it does, you've got to keep continually saying, "Pretty boy, hello," the same words over and over and over again.
One sausage or two.
Yes, one sausage or two. And it will eventually repeat it because it can't hear the other birds. They can't hear anything else. It might even, remember the old telephones, what used to bleep? Budgies could imitate that.
right.
And like starlings, the minor birds. And so if you keep talking to it, it becomes like a son or a grandson or a granddaughter or a grandson because you want a cock bird.
Right.
So they're amazing pets, they are.
Your original question, Simon, was what is a budgerigar? Now, Chris thinks budgerigars are the world, and I admire him, and I love his budgerigars. Could I, from a scientific perspective, say budgerigars are grass parakeets, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's right.
They're the only representative of a family of citizen parrot-like birds in Australia. They have the most wonderful scientific name. It's Melopsiticus undulatus, which is a rather ugly mixture of Latin and Greek. The Greek bit, Melopsiticus, means the melodious parrot, Melopsiticus, and that's because of the wonderful noise that they make. We heard it this morning in your aviaries. Undulatus, of course, as in undulations, is because when they fly in the wild in Australia, and if they're lucky enough to, with decent sized aviaries like Chris's, they have an undulating flight. And they are the only representative. So they're a small grass parakeet. They come from Australia, only found in Australia in the wild. They weigh sort of 25 to 30 grams. That's about an ounce for the more old-fashioned people. They're all green in the wild, and their conformation is rather different. They're slimmer birds, I think, Chris, aren't they? I mean, they have to be because they fly. I
was in Australia last year, and I saw an aviary full of wild Australian budgerigars.
Yeah.
All light greens. They all had rather long tails.
Did they? Yeah.
And the way they flew around it was a big aviary.
I bet that's a delight to see.
It was a delight. Yeah. And I didn't want to leave this. There was an Australian zoo of Australian animals and birds.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful sight. And I must admit, I felt a little bit guilty to looking at my birds. They're completely different.
But then that's true of domestic dogs and looking back at jackals and wolves. They may have come from those, but we've selected them and they give us pleasure. Birds have been kept for centuries, for millennia. I've actually brought in, the listeners can't hear it. They can hear what I'm doing, not see it. And this is a bamboo from China. We brought it back from China. And these are the sort of, he says, trying to open it up. These are the traditional bird cages made of bamboo with little feeders, etc. in, which they not only have on display, because with many of the other birds, they have singing competitions, but you can buy these. You can see what basic structure it is. But these are probably the same design. Note they're round, not square, which I think is significant, that would probably in China have been in existence 3,000, 4,000 years ago, most of it made locally. It's a reminder that bird keeping is not some strange fad now. Keeping birds, look at domestic poultry and ducks and so on, has been part of our evolution and part of our feeling of being with nature. So coming back to the budgerigars, I suppose to summarise, it's a small citizen parrot bird. It's unique in terms of where it comes from and its scientific name. It's got, to a vet, many of the characteristics of the other parrot family, which is why I often use parrot medicine books and things like that. But it's got features of its own, which we're about to come on to later.
Yeah. Fantastic. So we're agreed on that, Chris. That's what we're dealing with.
Yes. Okay. Yes, we are dealing.
Which is good because you've been doing it for nearly 60 years. If you were going to disagree with John, that would be quite alarming.
Well, see, the first budgerigars came into England with Professor John Gould.
As in Gouldian Finch.
Yeah,
yes,
Gouldian Finch.
Great John Gould.
1840. So we're talking nearly 180 years.
But I have to say, it was first named Melopsittacus undulatus.
Yes.
30 years before that, based on dead bodies, on skins, and the person who named them, whose name I've forgotten now, it's a short monosyllabic word, was one of the two founders of the Linnean Society of London. He was a medical graduate, he loved birds and things, and he identified this little parakeet and gave it that wonderful name.
You do know where the name Budgerigar came from?
Isn't it Aboriginal or something?
Yes. Budgerigar is the Aboriginal name for the Budgerigar. So it's the derivative of Budgerigar to Budgerigar.
So, Chris, you mentioned when you saw these budgerigars in the wild, and I think you mentioned in the zoo as well, in Australia. That's right, yeah.
I didn't see him in the wild. I just saw him wild caught there. Yeah.
Right, wild caught birds. But I think you also mentioned that I was picking up on the fact that you come back home, look at your birds and your aviary, and you kind of feel that they're not.
I felt when I was looking at these birds in this aviary in Sydney, New South Wales, I felt very sad,
right?
Because I look at some of the birds which are huge and they can't breed. It's something I am presently the president of the Budget Society and on the General Council. Is one of my jobs is to the well-being of the exhibition Budgerigar. And I think you've seen my aviaries, my birds, and they need flights, they need outside flights, they need sunshine, they need rain, they need a balanced diet, all these things. And we've got to look after the birds we've got.
Right. So from a behaviour and also a social needs perspective, can you explain just a little bit more about the importance of this statement for budgies? You know, why it seems very normal, natural, makes sense. A bird's got to fly, but these are also birds that are kept in cages. So why have they got to fly? Well,
it's a bit like us. You got a nice office here, Simon, but if you was in this office 24/7 for 3 or 4 years, you'd go crazy. First of all, you wouldn't get the exercise. You'd be overweight. Your skin would be white. You would not be healthy because you were getting no sunshine. You're getting no fresh air. So that's why I believe that the birds have got to have these exercise. And also, if you don't walk or exercise, within a year you won't be able to walk at all.
Right.
And it's a bit like flying. If the birds can't. When they're babies, 6 weeks old, they start flying, and if you put them into a small cage, they'll stop flying.
So is there disagreement then within the fancy over
there's
what budgie is?
A lot of people disagree with me, but I just think, I'm thinking about the birds rather than people. I always put my birds first.
I think also we have to bear in mind, this is super what Chris has said, and any one of us who cares about the well-being, welfare of birds and other animals would say that. But if my wife was here, and she may be listening, an animal lawyer, she'd say that the legislation in Britain and many countries of the world is based on what were called the 5 freedoms, that a captive animal must have water, food, etc. And one of those is must be able to exhibit normal behaviour. And I think if a budgerigar is in a cage and isn't allowed out at all, and of course hopefully they are, then that behaviour pattern is not being met. But the way Chris and many of his more enlightened colleagues keep them with the flight. I mean, when we went into yours this morning, those young birds who said just come out there, they were a bit wary, and of course they flew to the other end. A very short-term stress reaction because there were people coming in. That's good. That's escape. That's necessary. But they could fly there. They could come back when we went in. So I think a legal and thereby probably both a legal and an ethical requirement should be to let them fly if they can, even if it's only in the house, because you keep them in a cage. Because I wouldn't want to knock cage keeping completely. We both know about individuals, and you've alluded to one, old people, people in care homes, hospitals, etc., for whom that bird in the cage is so important.
So, John, what's the science behind this? So that all makes sense from an art perspective. Chris is saying, look, it makes sense to me that a bird's got to fly. We're saying from a legal perspective, it is probably, the legal responsibility is to allow and encourage a bird to fly. What's the science? What benefits are there for the bird to be able to? Chris has already mentioned some of them, but from a for their biology, will a bird keeper have a better bird if the bird can fly?
Oh yes, I think certainly so, because the flying, as Chris said, it's exercise. The blood becomes oxygenated. There's therefore a better blood supply to newly growing feathers. There's a better blood supply to the oviduct wrong side, left-hand side, and in a budgerigar, the ovaries, with egg laying, etc. Yes, there's all those. And I sense you might have been saying before, what's the evidence that it's good? Well, the whole concept of these 5 freedoms, and some people call them 5 domains, doesn't matter, the 5 requirements of captive animals, is that work has been done, originally on farm animals and subsequently on zoo and other species, whereby you give the animal a choice. And if you put budgerigars into an environment where they have access to perches, they will use them. If you put them in an aviary where they can fly, they will use them. If they just sat at one end and were disinterested, then the scientists would argue, well, that is not a behavioural need that needs to be met. But in my view, and from the scientific work that's been done, budgerigars that can fly are performing natural behaviour, and we should encourage that, and we should be judged as people who believe in bird keeping on the fact we're following what nature dictates.
Yeah, very interesting. Is there what's creating this divide then in terms of what? Because John's cleared up scientifically what a budgie is, and we've agreed with him that's what it is. So why, that's what a budgie is, but what a budgie should look like? Are we going? Is this to do with showing? It's
to do with showing. When I started in the 60s, the birds were probably 50% smaller. A lot smaller than they are today. Everything was smaller, the size, the weight. And
VW Golfs, they were a lot smaller.
They were a lot smaller.
Yeah.
And breeding in the 60s was quite easy, and changes started in the 70s when some of these big birds appeared. And now we had them, me and my late father, and they didn't breed so well. And then you got these buff birds, which the feathers are really rough looking.
I like disagreeing with you and challenging you. That was not the budgerigar's fault, was it? Not fanciers selected. You fancied the big ones. So started to pick out ones that would make a good show bird. And we can have a new class in show for the one with the biggest face or whatever you've got the terminology. So it's not the bird's fault. That's just natural Darwinian, Wallacean.
I never said it was the bird's fault.
Selection, isn't it?
It's the human being's fault, the people who keep the birds. And I'm as guilty as anybody in the 70s and 80s. And the Budgie Society, we still have a standard. And the standard is a smart-looking bird, a nice head, everything in proportion. And there's some birds out there which are ginormous, and they've got these great big heads. They have a skirt on where the feathers, where the feet cross over. And people think they're wonderful birds. Well, they don't win on the show bench. They're stock birds. And I don't use those birds. I don't want to. So I'm always trying to breed, most important thing, healthy. And at the bottom of the list, good.
But
a good quality.
don't we have a problem that the show standards dictate what people breed? If they're showing, I mean, we should remind the listeners, some people just keep budgerigars because they like budgerigars, not because they want to show them.
The standard does. As a judge, I judge to the standard.
You have to.
Well, I have to, and some judges don't. Not many. And if they judge into their own standard, what they've got, I tell them, we have a standard. As long as the standard dictates what we should be looking for on the show pit, and that does happen. The last year's winner was a superb Spangled Grey, the McGovern's of Liverpool, and that was close to the standard as you get. It was in tip-top condition. There's some other birds here which was probably argued better, but they weren't to the standard.
Surely the point is whether the standards are such that a bird that wins, its winning reflects not just that it had all the points that you as a judge want, but also are compatible with its welfare. If I give an example, Simon, Crufts has just taken place, and there was great concern about these brachycephalic, flat-nosed dogs. And the British Veterinary Association has expressed concern, I think it was the French Bulldog class, the one that won, although it did not have the most severe brachycephalic flattened nose appearance, had things like narrower nostrils and so on than vets would like. And so they're pursuing this on the grounds that if shows are going to continue, and I'm all for shows of anything, horses and alpacas right down to spiders and butterflies, then they ought to reflect the standards, what is good for the animal as well. Otherwise, those who are opposed to birds in captivity, riding horses, keeping pet tarantulas, whatever it is, will say, there we are, you're not really interested in the welfare, your standards are ones that suit you for show, for getting a rosette.
You're absolutely right. Our standard, we still stick to it. And we actually, a rule, if a bird has an excessive long tail, an excessive long flight, it's got long flights and long tails, they're disqualified because they've gone one step too far. They're nothing like the standard. Now, some people love them.
But your wild, the ones you saw, the captive grass parakeets, you said to me they had longer tails.
They had longer tails.
Why have they got longer tails? Because presumably in the wild, that is selected for
flying.
By natural selection.
Natural selection, yeah. So
but in captivity, where they're not trying to evade predators.
Yeah, but these long flights, long tails, they're very, very ugly. And some people will think they're wonderful, and I think they're awful because I'm breeding birds to win at the big shows, and I don't want to breed a bird what's going to be disqualified.
Yeah.
And that's that is the Budgie Society, and they are correct in keeping that rule on. It started in the 50s. Yeah. That's how long it's been going for. So at the Budgie Society, we are aware, and we do stick to we have these rules, and the bird has got to be in perfect condition. So we are doing a lot for the hobby and keeping the size down.
Okay, so although you're breeding, for this, what a good looking budgie should look like, are you also being challenged because you personally believe then that a bird's got to fly?
Yes.
So that is drawing you away from what the perfect specimen of a budgie should look like. So at some point you're putting the health and the welfare. I'm not saying others aren't, but I think John is. If I was a listener, I would be thinking that this is the blueprint for the perfect budgie. But if we're saying in the wild the perfect budgie is the budgie that's surviving because natural selection and evolution is lengthening its tail and it's flying, but actually if it's not free living, then we are breeding it, pushing it into a direction where ultimately it won't fly. And you're saying no, mine must fly.
Exactly.
So that must put you at a disadvantage then.
Sometimes, but it's more important that the birds are healthy. And sometimes winning, it's I want to win with a healthy bird. And generally speaking, if you've got a healthy looking bird was not excess, it will win.
So Chris, if I said give me your top 5 arbitrary top amount of things, it's got to be healthy? Is that number one?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're not healthy, if you do reproduce, you produce birds who are unhealthy, and then the fertility goes. And the idea of keeping budgerigars in mind is for them to reproduce.
Yes, it's worth just winding.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm very tired today. I can't think of my words at all. Charles Darwin, before he wrote his Origin of Species, he kept pigeons and other birds, but pigeons, and he kept some of the standard fantails, tumblers, all these fairly strange but nevertheless well-recognised pigeon breeds, because he was interested in how selection processes affected birds in captivity as opposed to those in the wild. He was not against keeping birds in captivity, and he made the point that the selection pressures for the captive ones, as you said, implied, Simon, are very different. They don't have to, unless they're racing pigeons, avoid hawks, because most of the ornamental ones are just in someone's garden and are very rarely taken by a hawk, whatever it happens to be. So the concept of some birds and other animals being bred for traits that wouldn't survive, be advantageous in the wild, is not a new one, and we see it. Anyone who's listening to this keeps a cat or a dog or anything else, they are inevitably dealing with something that's been selected for captivity, not for the wild.
Okay, that's really important. So can we move on then from kind of behaviour and social needs? We'll come back to some of these things, and we do have questions from listeners. We've already got some coming in actually, and some from our existing customers. But can we talk a little bit more about the ideal environment? So, being an advocate for the importance of fly, how and John and Margaret Cooper, John's wife, were lucky enough to look around the aviary this morning. What's the perfect budgie habitat to create? How can you set and facilitate it really?
That's the big flights, as big as possible.
Really?
I think I was talking to
And
John.
for the listeners, a flight is essentially an aviary where they can fly. It sounds
an outside.
People living near Heathrow think a flight is something slightly different.
My flights are 15 feet by 3 feet, so that's a metre by 5 metres.
Yeah.
Outside flights.
Yeah, very good.
Open tops. I say open top wire, of course. All wire round. Perches either side, so they've got a good 10 to 15 feet to fly.
And you're copying what the wild budgerigars would have, but the difference is the wild budgerigars, I think there are 3 subspecies of different parts of Australia, have to keep flying to find food because they live in these arid areas. So they don't have to do that at Chris's because they've got the food. So the fact they're still flying shows that that's a requirement. They're not doing it for food. They know there are plenty of food hoppers and so on. So the fact they're still flying and that your flights provide that, it means you are essentially simulating the situation in the wild.
I like to do. I look at what the birds are doing in Australia and how they breed and how they live, and I try to replicate that in a different way into my aviaries. For example, when in the wild the hens leave the flock, they go to the nesting place, and the cockbirds follow a week later.
Do they?
So I always put my hens in first, and I put the cocks in. That's the nature.
Yes.
I consider it's only 180 years since they came in this country, but over the millions of years, it's still ingrained into them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they get outside flights, so they get the rain, which is very important, and sunshine.
Why is the rain? So the sunshine is important because...
Well, most vitamin B...
Vitamin D.
D.
Yeah. And the rain?
And the rain, well, it's pure water.
Right.
Although I do feed my birds.
But it encourages preening as well.
Yes, it does, yes.
Whereby the bird then... I mean, here, for example, this electron micrograph, which the listeners can't see, but the chairman and Chris can, show the barb. This is a barb of a feather. Those are 2 barbs there. These are the barbules, the little ones. And look how they interlock. It's like a zip fastener, okay? Those are all joined together. So when the bird flies, it's the equivalent of a wing of a plane or whatever. You get the lift, etc. But in order to maintain that, in the same way as my wife says I should use a comb for my hair, even though I haven't got much, you've got to keep it in good condition, etc.
You use a cloth, don't you?
A hose, usually, being a vet. Yeah. the situation, as I see it, is that rain also, as it does with all types of birds. I mean, just look at blackbirds when it rains and so on. They start preening. They get oil from their preen gland. They clean up their feathers. They feel better, as one does, ladies in particular. I'm sure I'm not allowed to say that. Like a hairdo, etc. So do birds, and their feathers are then interlocking beautifully, and they're better able to evade a predator or get up high or look for food or whatever.
So there's a social aspect to bathing as well. You mentioned, birds in the wild, so blackbirds and so on. My bird bath, there's never just one bird in there. Normally there's several sparrows, particularly. It is a social, gregarious type thing.
And they're learning all the time. They're learning, but if something appeared, it doesn't have to be a sparrowhawk. Even a magpie, perhaps even a cuckoo comes over and it looks like a hawk. Those birds alert one another, even if they're different species. So it's not just the one species, they're interacting, not perhaps in your aviaries.
The wild birds, the starlings and the blackbirds make a noise when there's a cat or and I recognise that now. And the birds
your birds.
I can be in my bird aviary and all of a sudden they stop. I go outside, there's a cat there or a sparrowhawk.
I wonder if they learnt that, because of course cats were not present in Australia until about 300 years ago.
It's I suppose that it's something that's going to kill them. They put it in pretty quick.
What are the considerations regarding? So there's the good side of fresh air, but what's the potential risks of fresh air?
The people say to me, "You got outside aviaries." I don't have outside aviaries because I have starlings near me, and the drop-ins could be. So I always say, or blackbird droppings. I sometimes in the autumn have where they eat the blackberries, they poo into the bird aviary, dark blue poo.
Yeah.
And the birds eat it. And I'm thinking, oh God. Okay, but why you don't? I say to them, but you never see do you ever see a sick wild bird? You don't, because they die overnight, and a fox or another bird will take them. And why are you concerned about wild birds? They're healthier than my birds, probably.
And I think a risk analysis is necessary. There are bigger dangers to not giving birds fresh air. Think COVID. Even in cars, still, I open the windows so it's air circulating. COVID, coronavirus, most other organisms will flourish in a bird room that has got dust everywhere, feather dust included, which comes from the feathers, where as you go in, and that's why I asked you this morning about cleaning, and you gave a super answer to it. And as you go in, you shuffle in, perhaps, if you're my sort of age, and you see dust going up. And inside is bound to be a bigger source of pathogens than outside. There are dangers everywhere, but that's part of life. So are we then as bird keepers trying to? We mentioned about some of the seasonal changes, for example. I'm interested in as climate and seasonal changes come about. We hear about some of the driest spells since records began, and also the next month it's the wettest spell since records began. So is that changing? Is that changing the behaviour of budgies specifically, or particularly because they're spending time in outdoor aviaries?
It's affected this last few years. It's probably a bonus to a budgerigar that the winters are not so cold. Right. They find that, I can remember in the 60s and 70s, it seemed to be cold every day between sort of December through to February. Now, and I think the records show it is warmer. 1 degree or 2 degrees is an awful lot in the temperature.
Chris, is that changing behaviour in terms of the breeding season being triggered sooner?
I think there's more birds being bred. You don't breed a lot of birds in the winter. And I think with the warmer weather, it's like I live on the East Coast. If you go to the South Coast or even to, say, France, where it's warmer anyway, they breed better in the winter, but the best time to pair them up is in the spring.
Right.
But there are going to be disadvantages as well. I should think your listeners are pleased they can't see this particular pot, but this is the head of a domestic chicken. And you can see, Chris, around the eyes here, all these little parasites. Yeah. These are called stick-type fleas, which when I first went to Africa as a young vet, were only found in the tropics. They are moving up through Europe and sooner or later they will appear on domestic poultry, on pheasants, on crows, probably not on budgerigars, but they will appear here. And your budgerigar fancy will sooner or later, probably, hopefully, but because of closer liaison with the vets, discover that some of the blood-borne parasites that birds get on the continent are appearing in budgerigars here, which is why record keeping is so important. If, for example, someone loses more young birds in a nest box, we found one this morning and you kindly gave it to me to look at, that was dead in a nest box. Chris has got between 200 and 300 budgerigars, so you're bound to have the odd death occasionally. One may mean nothing and it probably doesn't need to be looked at. But if tomorrow there was another one, and in a week's time you said, that's strange, I've had 6 deaths, etc., that could be a pattern that you should report and get people to look at, because it might be one of these infections that is approaching us from the south.
So can we talk about, that will move us into health and well-being really, John. So from a veterinary perspective, if I'm a bird keeper, am I potentially, and I'm not a bird keeper, but am I guilty in preempting some of the things that can go wrong with our birds? So I'm thinking specifically of antibiotics. So if I'm loading antibiotics into a bird because I'm in fear of some of these terrible things that can happen, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
If you're loading the bird, it's a bad thing.
Right.
If you're loading a person, it's a bad thing. I mean, antibiotics are a miracle. When I was born, there was in 1944, there was penicillin and sulfonamides and nothing else. And sulfonamides saved the life of Churchill in the war, remember? We're very, very fortunate to have them. But they should be kept for what they're really good at, which is life-threatening diseases, which are properly diagnosed. Because otherwise our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will find that they cannot get treatments that used to work for meningitis, for example, because the antibiotics that worked for me when I was their age, this is post-1944, now the bacteria are resistant to.
Sorry, John. So can you just bridge that gap for me? So I think I basically understand that if I as a human are using antibiotics and I shouldn't be, then I understand that. But how does preloading budgie, how can that affect your grandchildren? Just that I think is going to be a lot for me to swallow. Yeah,
I know it's not easy, because say you do and he doesn't, Chris. Now, if you do load up a budgerigar or any other bird,
we should state that Chris doesn't. No, we know that. Yeah,
we've checked him.
Yeah, we have.
Actually, but he seems an honest bloke. Because although the antibiotics will kill lots of the bacteria in the bird's gut, some of the bacteria will be able to resist that antibiotic. They will come out in the droppings and they will predominate Darwinian, Wallacean selection again. And those bacteria that are resistant to flucloxacillin or whatever it happens to be, one of the antibiotics, Chris could, if he was dealing with them, pick up those bacteria that are resistant to that from his birds. He wouldn't, because he washes his hands, as I saw today, as soon as he comes into a bird.
Right.
But those bacteria, you then, by a child, could put their fingers in their mouth. Those bacteria colonize their intestine, and then when they are treated with the same flucloxacillin or whatever it happens to be, those bacteria flourish because they are resistant. So it's the bacteria that go from one species to another. They get into foodstuffs and so on, and then subsequent hosts are not able to respond.
Are we talking zoonosis here?
It's not. Zoonosis is really an infection that's transmitted from one to another, and we've got many that are occasionally a problem with budgerigars. It's in the same category.
Right.
It's this sort of one health concept that we don't just think, oh, I'm a human being. I get certain diseases, animals get others. I mean, coronaviruses are an example. All species of animals pretty well have coronaviruses, and we learn from one another. It's a similar thing. We should protect our health by protecting the health of animals.
But I think I'm getting that, though. So it was believed, so COVID-19 was believed to have originated in bats before crossing over to humans. So if we're feeding budgies antibiotics and they don't require it, then that's the thing that's the missing link that I'm looking for.
Yes, and I mean, I've been advocating, and I was talking about it last night, Well, first of all, antibiotics are sometimes needed, and I'm the first one to say when they are needed in birds or anything else, they must be. But for that purpose, and it must be based on a diagnosis, not someone who says, "Oh, I happen to have this. I brought it back from Belgium. It might help."
Can we come back to diagnosis in a moment?
Okay.
Just because there's a link between the keeper, the bird, yourself, Chris, and the vet. So how do we get that diagnosis? But we'll just come back to that later.
I mean, the main thing is we want to maintain health. I mean, budgerigars have evolved, as Chris said, over millions of years. And they've not only evolved as birds in their own environment and over the past 200 years in captivity, but so also have the bugs in their intestines and on their skin. And those bacteria in the intestine, many of them are beneficial to the bacteria, to the bird.
Right.
So we don't want to be giving antibiotics unnecessarily for a second reason, because we're getting rid of beneficial ones. The same way as humans who have antibiotics. Antibiotics often develop diarrhea and things like that, and the answer is stop taking the antibiotics.
So can I ask John the question that about 10 years ago, I was visiting Germany with Phil Reaney and Jack Kighton from Holland.
Yes.
And a vet there, and it was on the Friday night before the show, and to be quite honest, we had a few too many beers. And
beers,
yes.
I said birds. Beers.
And this is the bears with feathered ones. and he said to me, Chris, he says, do you your flock, do you give them a medicine once a year to avoid getting the diseases? And I said, yes, I do. Yes. He says, why? And I thought to myself, I said, because other people do.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, are your bears permanently ill? I said, no, they're fine. He said, well, why give them an antibiotic or a medicine when they don't need it?
Yeah.
Now, what's your opinion? Because
I'd say exactly the same. I mean, we don't, as human beings, say once a year I must ask the doctors, the poor old National Health Service, to load me up with antibiotics to kill every known bug.
No, but we get a flu jab every year, don't we?
Yeah, but that's a vaccine, and we can. I mean, we don't have. The Americans, for example, have a vaccine for one of them, either French mold or cystine beak and feather disease. I'm a bit rusty. We don't have a specific vaccine for anything in budgerigars, but many other birds, pigeons, for example, are vaccinated against paramyxovirus and pox, etc. Protection with a vaccine is different. That does rarely any harm. It just produces antibodies in the human.
Right.
But giving something to kill bugs in the bacteria, I mean, in the intestines, or dusting powders on wounds, we better put some antibiotic on, it's just not necessary. Wounds on the outside can just be irrigated, or one of these non-antibiotic preparations used, and there are plenty of them. I mentioned one last night, which is Vetricin, but it's not because I have any shares in it, but I use it, etc. And the intestinal bacteria, they're part of that bird's existence. That budgerigar has its ecosystem is the world outside and the world inside. The world outside is the sun, the rain, the food, and everything you've mentioned. The world inside is the bacteria that live in its intestine, and we upset those bacteria at our peril. So if a bird needs anything once a year, I would say give it one of these probiotics, which is a dose of bacteria, mainly things like lactobacilli, a bit like yogurt, which do no harm. They go through the intestine and they compete with the unpleasant bacteria, and they tend to take over. And so I would say if they want to use something, use probiotics. Look on the internet, you'll find plenty of them.
So I don't do that. Should I do that?
No, only if you're worried. It's just you'll know some of your fancier friends, and we have it with all animals, don't feel comfortable unless, as you say, they're doing what their friends do.
Yes.
So, I mean, I would challenge your society, those who still think they ought to give antibiotics, why don't half of you use antibiotics and half of you give a probiotic and see if there's a jot of difference?
They'll give probiotics, they'll give antibiotics, then they'll feed them probiotics. So it seems, why don't you just leave them?
Exactly. I mean, nature knows best. I mean, this balance is 140 million years, can't be wrong.
Can we then move onto the significance of diet then? Because it seems to me that, I mean, going to a vet and somehow, getting hold of antibiotics and so has a cost, must have a cost.
Yes.
Probiotics must have a cost. So if we work on prevention being better than the cure, isn't it better just to, apart from the illnesses that happen to all of us, not just budgies? But that being said, a healthy diet is
important.
I
I think we've said this in every podcast we've done. The balanced diet of good quality seed is that they are seed eaters, budgerigars. So if you give them the best seed available,
and supplement it when you've got other things, as they do in the wild. They feed on seeds in the dry season when the seeds are out, and then when the rains come in Australia and plants start to sprout, as do germinating seeds, of course.
Yes.
Then they feed on that and they get extra protein. Yes. I think again we should be simulating. That's what.
Chris, you do that, don't you? Really? So you simulate that by feeding what's available on a seasonal basis and supplementing or adding to the value of seeds.
If my favourite food is probably Lincolnshire sausages, potatoes, gravy, and a bit of tomato sauce, and some peas. That's my favourite. But if I had that every day of the year, it would drive me crazy.
You gave us chickweed with our breakfast this morning. Is there a reason for that?
So what I tried. I stick to the main diet, the canary seed, and I have my own mixture, which Haith produced for me, and that is, in my opinion, the balanced diet. But they need seasonal food. Like we have seasonal food when we have salad in this, and different foods, different times.
And you look forward to it, don't you? And birds do. I mean, you said yourself you put chickweed or groundsel or one of the other things.
Well, I don't use groundsel. It tends to give them diarrhea. It's a bit too strong.
Whatever. But
chickweed,
seedling, people will use groundsel and they'll use teasels and so on.
Seedling grasses. I live in the country, so I can go. I pick bags and bags of this top of the seed. They absolutely love that.
And we come back to those 5 freedoms, Simon, that if the birds like it, you are enhancing their natural behaviour and at the same time giving them a quality diet.
Yeah.
You're giving them a tested, proven, proprietary diet, which you're getting here from Haith, the one that they make up for you, and you're supplementing it with things that you know they like, but they don't get it every day.
Yeah. So we're saying, look close. I can't remember who said it out. I think it's Thoreau that said, look closer to nature. All will be revealed and so on. I think that's where we're going here, isn't it? Can we then talk a little bit more about the importance of clean, fresh, and dust-free in terms of the lengths that there will be others, I hope, other than Haiths that will try to remove as much dust as possible. We, of course, would like to feel that we do a better job, but just in the interest of, forgetting who creates the diet for a moment, what are the dangers of dust, John? I think this is from a scientific perspective. How harmful is it to birds? And I think then reassure me as a director of Haith why we spend so much blooming time and money trying to remove it, because and obviously reassuring people like Chris who spend a little bit more on quality diet that they're doing the right thing. A lot of questions, a lot to unpack there.
I think we should say that dust in excessive amounts is dangerous to every living creature. One only has to think of the coal dust when coal miners during the Second World War were working those long shifts and their lungs were destroyed by it. One only thinks about people who keep horses. Not only do their horses react to dust-filled straw and hay, mainly hay. Poor quality, you pull out the hay bale, you pluck out some hay, and dust goes everywhere. They react to it, the horses react to it, etc., and birds do as well. And the answer is that dust can either have an immediate or almost immediate acute effect, a bit like Chris and I are coughing occasionally here. We inhaled a bit of dust and we just cough it out, etc. And animals, budgies don't cough as such, but they can bring it up. But when there's exposure, often day in and day out, to more dust than there should be. And remember, dust is not just, as you say here, Haith's a dirty word. Dust is particles of material that's of no nutritional value. It is little bits of fibre, it's little bits of lignin from plants, it's little bits of stone even, little tiny particles that float around and they settle. And then when the bird feeds, it ingests them, it eats them with its beak, of because remember, a bird prehends, picks up its food with its beak. It hasn't got hands like a primate to bring them to it. The same apparatus in a budgie. You've got a beak, which is picking up the food. You've got nostrils that can take in anything that's in that food. All those organs are together. And when you get to the back of a budgie's throat, the dust or the food or the air can go either down the esophagus and finally into the stomach, or it can go down the trachea and finally into the air sacs. And if there's dust there, then the dust also takes one of those routes. The dust is going to do less harm in the intestine, but it's still not good. It's not being absorbed, not being digested, not being absorbed. It's a waste of the bird's enzymes working on that, other than grit, which we might get onto later on. But if it goes down into the respiratory tract, or even just into the nostrils and into the sinuses, then it irritates, and so birds will get sinusitis. Parrots in particular, tropical parrots, will get swollen sinuses, because almost entirely it's dust and foreign bodies have got there. So dust is dangerous, and in the really long term, it can produce, a bit like the coal miners, chronic fibrotic lesions, which don't matter so much with budgies that are not being raced, but ask the pigeon people or the falconers, and they will say, my bird had this chronic respiratory problem and it just never flies properly again. And it's irreversible, as it is in humans,
Yes.
unless you have a lung transplant.
Okay, that's brilliant. Let's talk grit. You mentioned grit, and we had a meeting last night. It was your lecture, John, and Margaret Cooper for the Lincolnshire Budgerigar Society, and we asked the room. Am I allowed to say that we asked them who fed grit? And actually, it 100%. Was 100%.
Feed grit.
100% feed grit.
They were a bit frightened of you, I think, Simon. That's why. If we asked them in private, they'd probably say something different.
No, they wouldn't.
We'll do those phone calls later.
No budgie keeper's afraid of anybody.
No. We're a tough lot up here.
It's what it did strike me though, because I'm half of me is I was born in Cheltenham, but my the other half of my family is Yorkshire, and I'm proud to be a Yorkshireman as well, or at least half of me. Now
the cricketing.
Now here's the thing: I'm investing in good, clean, healthy diet. The dust has been removed. The ingredients, the produce in that mix has been put together and formulated in a meaningful way, and it works for birds. And because of that, it's probably cost a little bit more. So it's a quality diet. That's great. So far, so good. But what struck me last night was that if you're not feeding grit, your birds are not extracting the maximum nutrition from that seed mix. So actually, you're paying for a good quality diet, but overlooking that maybe, I don't know what percentage of nutrition is being missed.
Good teeth in the human. Yeah.
Exactly. Why are we not feeding grit? So John, could you scientifically explain to us the benefits, or at least what insoluble and soluble grit is, and why I might be onto something? Chris will say, hang on, I've been onto it for 60 years, Simon, but I'm a slow worker here. It's finally dawned on me. It's not just about that it will do the birds will benefit from a calcium perspective, potentially. It's how much more nutrition they will get from that seed. So if you're not feeding grit, you're not getting the maximum benefit. Why is that the case potentially, John?
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to say that most species of bird have been ingesting stones of some sort or another for a long time. I am rattling here some stones from the gizzard of a moa, M-O-A. It was a giant ostrich. There were several species, and they lived in New Zealand for a long time, but they became extinct at least 200 years ago, probably 500 years ago. When my wife and I were in New Zealand, we were taken out and shown stones, little clusters of stones, and the Maori people said, this is where once a moa died, a moa bird, hundreds of years ago. All that's left are the stones that were in its stomach. So, and they some of them considered these to be sacred. I'm just saying that apart from the opportunity to rattle me stones in the microphone, because most birds, I'm saying that because birds of prey, for example, do not take grit. They don't take insoluble grit, they still take in calcium. But the vast majority of birds take in grit, including all citizen birds, even lorikeets and lories, which are essentially sugar, nectar feeding birds. You would argue they don't even need it. But in the case of budgerigars and other seed-eating birds, they take it in for two reasons. The insoluble grit to which you referred, which is like my stones here, just literally stones, pebbles if you like, but tiny ones, go into the gizzard, which is the mechanical part of the stomach. They sit there, and as food comes down, particularly seeds, it's ground up like a mill, and the stones help to break down the outside of the seeds, the kernels and so on, and thus either liberate or make it easier for enzymes later on to get in and digest the food. A bird that hasn't got stones breaking it down is likely to pass out many more undigested seeds than one that has. Now that is the insoluble grit. The soluble grit, I think it's a shame in many ways that they have these terms. The soluble grit, that a soluble meaning can be dissolved, refers mainly to minerals, and we're thinking particularly calcium. Birds' skeletons need calcium. Birds' muscles need calcium. An egg-laying female, if she's not to become egg-bound, needs calcium for the muscles, the oviduct, etc., to contract. And so the correct amount of calcium is necessary, and the soluble grit, which I think in the case of Haith is oyster shell, is it?
We had a fine oyster shell grit.
Yeah, and oysters are mollusks, and mollusk shells are made up of calcium carbonate, so it's pretty well a pure calcium supplement. So you've got the two types. The latter, there is no doubt at all that every bird must take in sufficient calcium and other minerals, and it doesn't matter what any fancier says, those birds must take that in. The controversy in some places, and obviously not in the Budgerigar Society last night, was about these insoluble ones. People have said, oh, my birds manage without it. Some people, there wasn't last night someone in the audience who says, I can remember being told that a bird died because its gizzard was full of grit. Well, odd human beings die because they've got some psychological problem and they swallow pebbles or they swallow keys or whatever. You're always going to have the odd exception. But I have never, ever, ever done a post-mortem examination or taken a radiograph, an X-ray, of any citizen bird, normal citizen bird, one that has not had various things done to it, that hasn't got grit inside it. In fact, I say to students, if there's no grit there inside its gizzard, there's something wrong.
Right.
And as a naturalist and as an evolutionist, and we've mentioned Darwin and Wallace and so on, there has to be a reason that they waste time, apparently, as they do here, just outside Haith. They will land where on the edge of the road and they'll pick up the sort through. This is not budgerigars, of course, it will be finches and so on, perhaps a yellowhammer if you're very lucky, and they'll ingest it and I will find those stones in the stomach. So I asked myself, there has to be a reason. And why should we, because they're in captivity, start saying, oh, you don't need it? I am adamantly in favour of both types of grit. I don't sell it, I don't take it myself, I just know it's good for them.
So, Chris, you kind of not scientifically, but you've always known instinctively, and from your birds, bird health.
When I first started in the 60s, we bought grit. I was 10 years old. I didn't know I was buying grit, but I soon learned that it's the teeth of us. Right. I'll tell us a story. A friend I used to work with, his father had all his teeth out, and he wouldn't get false teeth, and he used to mush his food in his mouth. And he died at an early age through his stomach problems. It's if you don't feed grit, you're harming the birds.
Fantastic. And can you tell me how you present grit? Is it just always available?
Always available. In my aviaries, I have probably a 4-inch pot full of grit, and then the aviaries, and in the breeding cages, I have a finger drawer of grit, and I replace I do it every 2 or 3 weeks, and every time it's empty.
Right.
And if they can go without grit for a few days, few weeks, because they've got it in them, and they don't. I think I said to you earlier, probably all the grit I buy, probably only 2% used.
Right.
But you've got to have it there. And they, if I put fresh grit in the aviaries as I did yesterday, they'll come down and looked and just picked up one piece or two pieces. So they don't need much.
There's obviously a responsibility, John. You talked about the 5 freedoms and so on, really. But there's this, this point of ethical bird keeping, and I suppose also we've talked about budgies in the wild, and that makes me think about sustainability as well. How can bird keepers promote these more sustainable practices in bird keeping? Is this now on bird keepers' radars that we've got to think more about the ethical side of bird keeping and sustainability in terms of obviously keeping birds generally?
I think we've got to look at all those things. It's a modern thing, and we've changed our birds, the budgerigars, so much. We've got to be very, very aware of this.
Yeah, because one of the objectives, I imagine, is bringing new people into the hobby and sharing. John and I, and I'm sure John will say the same. But it was a wonderful evening, and your colleagues, fellows of the Lincolnshire Budgie Society, have so much information, so much knowledge to share, and it strikes me that when people are looking for hobbies and interests and what can I do with a little bit of spare time, joining your colleagues would be a great way to spend a couple of evenings every month. It was, and but there's so much to learn, and I wonder whether that puts people off as well, though. How do I go from keeping 1 bird, 2 bird, or is there can I join a society like yours if I only have 1 bird? Or do I have to be a show?
You don't have to have birds to join the society.
Really?
No,
oh, crikey.
No, it's not so.
Just a checkbook, is it?
Yes. And come along to the meetings, and we'll get you into the hobby. And my club, the Lincolnshire Budgie Society, we've got a vast experience of people there. And if somebody new started, we would give them some birds, and to get them going.
That's and is there talk? I think we talked briefly about it last night. Some people who had contacted your fellow members of the society, and they purchased, or they've been given a budgie really to encourage them. There was a lot of talk about how it made them feel, how happy they were, how much dialogue had come post that handing over of the budgie to say how pleased and what a lovely feeling it gave somebody to be in charge of a budgie. And doesn't ask a lot from us, does it really? As well?
No, we have a pet dog, Roo, and she's a part of the family. She's like the child we never had. So, and the bird can be the same. All right, they're not as affectionate probably as a dog, but they can be in the cage there, and it's good company. You wake up in the morning, somebody to come downstairs into the living room and say, "Good morning, Joey." And that's important for older people, even for younger people.
Right.
When now in the 60s, everybody seemed to have a pet budgie, didn't they?
Yeah. But if I may say so, and this is meant to encourage, not just to criticise, I think your society could do 2 things better. Nothing to do with winning rosettes and having bigger spangles or whatever. One is to, and you've alluded to it, point out the value of birds in society. I've got here, for example, from Cage and Aviary Birds of October the 12th, 1984, Bird Club Plan for Hospital. And it starts off by saying, after forming a Budgerigar club at Broadmoor, that's Broadmoor Special Hospital, in 1960, and building the aviary there, and they went on to say they'd done one at Park Lane, which is another special hospital. My father worked at Broadmoor in the 60s, and I used to go in as a young student and as a young vet and look at the patients' budgerigars, their hamsters and so on. And I was aware the Budgerigar Society had been giving that help all over those years. And gestures like that, I think, when we're in a society where so many people talk about mental health and loneliness and so on, and poor souls whose lives, they're locked up somewhere and probably many of them not come out. This sort of thing could be replicated, and what wonderful PR it would be for the club, the society. The other thing is I said I started off as a naturalist. If your members were seen not just to know about budgerigars in captivity, but be the people with the ears and the eyes who know about birds, why don't we hear so many yellowhammers? A little bit of bread and no cheese. We don't hear them very often now. You said there were probably no linnets in your hedge. I don't know why. We could do with people in the fancy being seen by the public as knowledgeable. And if I just last example, Wildlife and Countryside Act, when it came in, and there was a provision made for the care of sick and injured wild British birds. I had a big battle with particularly the RSPB saying, but the people who know best how to look after birds, if a young fledgling or nestling even comes in, or something with a broken wing, finches, for example, are the birds who keep them in captivity. I learned how to strap up wings in wild birds from people who kept canaries. And okay, yours are not indigenous British birds, but if the society was seen to be a bit more, if I may say so, part of concerns about natural history and conservation, I think that would do a lot of good.
Well, what we have created, the Budgie Society, a few years ago, was the Pet Bird Association. It was, I'm not sure how much, the membership is very small. It's to get people interested in birds. If they only have one pet bird, is to join this as part of the Budgie Society, but a lesser fee, to get them involved and all the information on how to look to
and never show a bird, just enjoy having it.
Just enjoy having it. So that's what we've done. The idea is to get them interested, and hopefully if we can get a few of those people to get a few more, then join the major society. So we are doing our bit to do that. It's going quite well. But it's so damn difficult to get younger people involved in the hobby. Because now these days they've got so many other things to do.
Yes, yeah, and I think we're back to probably where we started, which is how do we make some of this information, this knowledge base, and there's obviously a lot of knowledge sat here with me right now, as our listeners will be able to tell. But how do we share this information with people? How do we make it easy for them to leap and make that start and stay with budgies? Or just become part of a community. You know, as you say, you don't have to, but you don't even have to have a bird to join your society. But the interesting thing is that there's so much talk about mental health and mental well-being and so on. There must be an element of keeping birds that can help people feel grounded and connected. With something that's to look after and other than themselves.
If anybody's listening to this, I would suggest, if they're interested in birds, is to contact the Budgerigar Society. I think they're in Perth now. The General Secretary, asking for information, and he will gladly give you information about keeping Budgerigars.
Okay, let's move on to some questions. We've got some questions from the panel, some of the Haith team who are listening, and also from customers who we asked for a few questions from. And we've got a couple of customers listening as well. So this first one really is about budgie characteristics. It's about habitat and diet. So what are some unique characteristics of budgies compared to other bird species? And can we explain their natural habitat, which we've already done that really, haven't we? And typical behaviours in the wild. So I think we've done that as well. What should I feed my budgie for optimal health? And let's do that.
A good balanced diet, mixture of seeds. You should have about 50% canary seed in your diet. I usually a mixture of millets and some tonic seed in it. In fact, I do Haith do me a Snell 66 mix, which is my 8 seeds. Fresh water, I give them well water from the wells, unfortunately where I live. Grit, and a little bit of green food, a bit of carrot, and that's a balanced diet.
Brilliant. Okay, that's great. In terms of a seed mix, could where would you put the carrots? Would you put it in a separate bowl, or would you add it to the seed mix?
You can just give them a little bit of carrots in the wires if it's a few bit. If an aviary, I usually cut a big carrot in half.
People used to put a stub of carrot when they had budgerigars in cages in the bars there, and it encouraged the bird to come and visitors could see it. And it used to be argued it kept its beak down. I don't think it did very much, but they were getting vitamin A from the carrot.
And I feed organic carrots. The difference between an organic carrot and a normal carrot is tremendous. Some of these carrots have grown in water in Africa. You don't want them. What they didn't get in.
Well, speaking on behalf of Africa, you might be even more dangerous if you have non-organic ones from a farmer in Lincolnshire who uses too many pesticides.
True.
Right, let's go on to the next question before we get sued. So, budgie behaviour and social dynamics. Really, I think this is about. So, what's the notable differences between behaviours of male and female budgies? And also, somebody wants to know how they might tame. How do I tame a shy or aggressive budgie?
Well, as I said earlier, if you want to have a budgie, the best bird to have is a young cockbird, a male from it leaves its parents about 6 weeks. And then you're taking it away from its environment of being a budgie to being a human. And then talk to it.
Right, brilliant.
And the difference between cocks and hens, if you put an aviary full of hens, they're quiet. They don't move very much, they'll fight a bit, and they'll just sit around. If you put an aviary full of cockbirds, they're flying around. The difference is unbelievable because they're trying to impress all the time. Obviously, the cockbird and the cockbird, they don't realise that they're all cockbirds. But the hens will be just listening, sitting there waiting.
I see.
So there is a big difference.
All right, Chris, and maybe John might want to come in on this one as well, but this is about health and illnesses, really. What are the most common illnesses in budgies? And what are the signs of illnesses? So how does somebody know if the budgie's unwell?
Yeah, Chris had better answer from a fancier's point of view what he sees as illness, whether it's loose droppings or whatever. He'll tell us that. And I might come in and sort of talk about illnesses as opposed to health and so on. Yeah.
Okay. It's similar to humans, really. They get diarrhea. It's usually green and it smells of it. They'll be sick and they bring back the food and then it comes out as a smelly sick and it can go all over their head. They can have nostrils bunged up and that's a discharge, which is smelly. And then the way to know a budgie when it's poorly is to sleep on 2 legs. A healthy bird will sleep on 1 leg and it would be just hunched up a bit. The feathers will be sticking out a bit, trying to keep it warm. And so it's there on two feet, looking different, not being alert, just sitting there.
And sometimes the respiration is.
Yes, the respiration and the tail.
And see the tail moves up.
Up
this is common to most birds, and it's where a good observer spots this. Whereas if the bird is taken into a vet, well, the bird is stressed before it gets there. It'd be breathing too fast in any case. This is why it would be much better if people actually went and visited people like, if vets went and visited people like Chris, learned about budgies while they were there, looked at some cases rather than them going to them.
Yeah. It's a bit like when, we're all healthy at the moment. If you was poorly and sick, you'd be sat there, your face would be drawn, you'd be hunched up, just exactly the same how you would feel when you're really poorly.
Yeah.
So be observant. Observe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Keep your eyes open.
And I think it's important to remember that there's the individual budgie with a problem and a problem that might be less easily detected, but it's in the flock as a whole, in the collection of the aviary as a whole. So, for example, you might have, as Chris says, a bird that gets transient diarrhea, gets over it in most cases, sometimes doesn't. You might have one that gets scaly leg or scaly face, which is a mite, and yet none of the others do, and yet that mite could infect them. And so we're increasingly aware that all
worms,
exactly, that all birds, like humans, some are more immunosuppressed than others, and a bird that's under the weather, again, stressors, or perhaps it's genetic, will demonstrate those. I think a worry that many of us have from a veterinary angle is the sort of epidemic diseases that can affect budgerigars. I mean, one must mention, for example, French malt, which was known for decades, was called by us the French malt, by the French the La Maladie Anglaise, because they thought it came from us. In fact, it came from Australia, which, well, you can explain. Do you still see them? Do you still see these young budgerigars scrambling around, unable to fly?
Yeah, you still get them. The last 3 or 4 years I inbred them. I think that's through my diet, and the bird's been healthier.
And also, would I be right to say you don't breed from birds that you think have got French malt?
Yes, I wouldn't breed of one. But I've heard of people that the birds had French malt and recovered and bred well.
Yeah.
And they're saying that it's got the antibodies in it. And
the trouble is it's polyomavirus, which is an immunosuppressive virus, and they might well be carrying the virus as well. So the virus will persist in the aviary, in the bird room, whatever. I mean, the general veterinary advice is cull, which I don't like because it really means kill. But birds that are affected, and don't use them for breeding. Try and get rid of the virus. And it's worth bearing in mind that and the similar but unrelated cytosine beak and feather disease, which affects other cytosines as well as budgerigars. Both of those flourish when there's dust, because the virus can survive in dust. So the added point about dust that we raise is the right word, earlier, is that the dust particles can carry viruses.
Okay. All right, let's move on to a specific health inquiry. It's specific, John. I imagine you'll say I need a lot more information, but let's see whether we can help somebody out. Somebody here is asking, they've got a 6-year-old male budgie called Freddie, got a name, shows discomfort in his right leg without visible cuts or lumps. Can budgies suffer from arthritis, or what might this symptom indicate?
Well, Chris might like to give his interpretation, I'll give mine. The first thing is, speaking as one who's got osteoarthritis, it would be nice to know the age and of this budgerigar.
6-year-old.
It was 6. Sorry, my apologies. Yes, which is
that's a good age.
It's a good age. So it's in the age group where arthritic changes can occur. But arthritis, well, you say what you think. It doesn't. Well, I think it might be something else.
I think it had a stroke. If its legs just lost its complete, it was just hanging. It might be just a mild stroke. And if it's 6 years old, unfortunately, that's a good age for a budgerigar.
Right. Bird keepers, not just budgies, have talked about strokes for decades. I had that book out yesterday from 1903, that lovely old collector's item, and it lists their ailments. Incidentally, even in 1903, it said if your budgie has got a tumour or it's got this and that, consult a veterinary surgeon. Vets did look at birds then. They didn't know much about them, but they're learning. But even that one there talks about strokes. And we don't know for certain, but strokes in budgies seem to be a sudden increase in the blood pressure, and they get a hemorrhage in the brain, just like a person. Depends on the sort of stroke in humans, of course, but one that's not thrombotic but is hemorrhage. And as a result, part of the brain is damaged. And that in turn can affect often I think I've got it right, the listeners will correct me, the other side leg or wing can be affected.
Right, that's right. And how long would a budgie be expected to live in the wild?
From 3 months to
3 years.
3 years. Yeah.
Right. So this is twice the age of a wild.
If you got one of those wild budgies and put it into a cage, it might last 6 or 7 years. But in the wild, they depend on the weather or the rain. They depend on the rain.
Yeah.
And if they got the rains on a regular basis, they would live probably till 8 or 9.
People forget that an animal in captivity is often given a longevity that they don't have in the wild. The critics would say, yes, but is the quality of life so good? Which is, we would say, Chris and I would share this belief, you've got to make that quality of life good. It's got to have environmental enrichment, interesting diet, company and so on. You just, as you do with older people, if they live longer, they need activities.
Can you just explain enrichment for a moment?
Yes, enrichment in the sense I'm using it is the one you all know about it in zoos and so on, but it's a very popular phrase now. It's to make a captive environment more interesting, just as they are in prisons. certainly in this country, I won't mention some of the other countries, so that prisoners and people who are detained have got plenty of stimulation, even though they're under these restricted circumstances. Yes, and the enrichment I'm talking about here, and I saw it in Chris's aviaries this morning, is, for example, he's got coconut shells. They had coconut in them originally. There were some budgies down on the floor who were still investigating them, probably hoping to get bits of coconut. But it doesn't matter. They were getting, it appeared, pleasure out of playing around and nibbling it. I mean, budgies like nibbling things. But the other thing was that Chris uses branches of eucalyptus, which is, of course, in Australia, there are many species of eucalyptus tree, and that you put those up in your aviaries, and I could see how they've been stripped by birds. That is environmental enrichment, and it's what we're promoting in British zoos. And we ask about it when we do an inspection, if there's not proper enrichment. Even a small enclosure, the public talk about this as a very small enclosure, but you can make the parameters of that enclosure more interesting by putting in extra perches, branches and things, and it stimulates the incumbent.
Thank you. Sorry.
The pet birds, they have mirrors, don't they?
Yes.
They have a false budgie there, and that's what they need. They need to keep themselves active, you know.
Yes.
It makes good common sense.
And an owner who speaks to them and is a partner, as you said earlier. Yeah.
One for you, Chris. So this is really covering breeding traits, selection, and setup. So what are the most sought after? I want to know everything here from you. What are the most sought after traits in show quality budgies? How do you select breeding pairs to achieve these traits, and including considerations for colour, pattern, mutation? And how do I set up the perfect cage environment for my budgie? So 60 years in boiled down to about 30 seconds, if we can.
Well, first of all, if you're a member of the Budgie Society, we have a standard. So look at the standard, and it gives you all the figures on there, and read it through. That will give you what we're looking for an exhibition bear to win a show. Pairing up. Now, I do it. Now, I've got a great memory. So when I put a cock and a hen together, first thing I look at is the faults of the birds. If they have a fault, small spots, a white or a narrow head,
But those are faults in terms of showing.
Yes.
They're not necessarily a health problem.
no, I'm looking at the show bird.
Yeah, okay.
Health problems, you just put two fit birds together. It doesn't matter. But if I'm doing an exhibition side, I would see the cock bird and I'll see the hen bird, and if they both got the same faults, I wouldn't put them together. So they've got to look slightly different. Now I'll be thinking of the cock birds. Now I can remember what the parents of that cock bird are. And I can go back to the great grandparents, and I'm thinking, hang on, his grandfather had a fault, and I tried to rectify it with that bird, and that bird still got it. And there's this hen, hang on, that one's grandmother had the same fault, so that would be, two of the grandparents have got the same fault. So generally, you're going to breed birds with the faults. So you got to put another bird in to thinking, they've got good heads. So I've got a good head there. The head could be better. So you're rectifying the faults.
But you've got a good memory, as you said, and you told me that in the bird room when I asked about records. Yeah. I think I would argue someone who hasn't got such a good memory, or whether they have or not, ought to be keeping records.
Well, you can.
Recording things, taking photos. Everyone except me has a smartphone now. They can take photos. That way you've got to, and you're effectively practicing genetics in a very art form.
It is. One of my greatest strengths in keeping exhibition birds is producing better birds than the parents. That's what I'm pretty good at. And I can look at the birds, and I can go to other people's aviaries and say, we pair the birds up, and I'll go, well, where's that one from? I can record that. That's the father, the mother's dead, and I can just... When I'm pairing up now, this morning I showed you I've got 15 pairs up. I've paired them up. And I will put the hens in the cages first, as I said to you, and leave them for a few days to settle. And I take the ring numbers, I know where they're from, I know that's cage state, and that's that cock, that's that hen. And it's holding me out, and all of a sudden I've got the cock birds. I look at that cock bird, and I think about his parents, and I think, bang, put them together. And I got that good feeling, and I'm probably 90% right. And then I think that's a good pair, and I expect good exhibition birds to come from that certain pair because I just have the feeling, It's gut feeling. It's something experienced.
It's art, not science.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so and at the other side of this is for someone new to budgie breeding, what are the essential steps, including the use of nest boxes, and how often should this person clean the budgie's cage, and what's the best method?
Well, you should clean it as much as possible. You're going to get droppings in. I put sawdust, heat-treated sawdust, in the bottom of my cages, and then the sawdust, when the hen's breeding, they're big, what we call wedding cake droppings, so you can set them out. But if you clean them, you don't want to clean them. If you clean them every day, it's going to upset them, but they get used to that. And the nest boxes, I use a nest box on the outside of the cage because it's easier rather than putting one inside.
Oh, right. Okay.
But you have a cage,
Yeah.
if you've got a nest box in, it takes out sort of 25% of the space, and they need that exercise.
Yeah, yours are great, and you can show people, as my wife Margaret this morning, just pull out that
Well,
tray
it's
inside.
easy. I make it easier for me and also for the birds. So I there's a hole in the wire, the nest box goes onto the cage front, and I can open it up and look inside. Rather than, we used to put the nest box, on the perch in the corner, and the nest box fell down when we was
And every time you open the cage door, it's seen as a threat by the budgies. Whereas the way you've got it now, that's not a threat. You can put your hand in and clean out the cage.
Yeah, that's right.
And are there any specific hazards or dangers that bird keepers should watch out for in the budgie environment? Anything they shouldn't introduce to the cage? We've talked before about mirrors and things like that. Are there things?
If you wanted to put a mirror and something
Can I say,
Yeah, go
don't put in anything that's been freshly painted.
Yes.
It might have lead in it, or it might have something else. And I take the view, and I mean, you may correct me here, they will nibble at anything that you put in. So anything that might contain something toxic, including some plastics, go carefully.
Yes.
And the main thing, as with all animal keeping, is don't suddenly introduce saying, oh, that's a very nice little item of cage furniture. I know you don't use cage furniture. I'll put it in all the cages, try it out in a couple first. If there are going to be problems, you'll discover from
Don't
that.
ever put any rope or string into an aviary, because the birds will chew it and they'll get entangled with it and die.
But they ingest some of it, and some gets around legs. Look at the pigeons in London that still have bits of thread around their feet.
Yes.
Is there a more popular colour of budgie to buy?
No, there's so many colours.
Right.
There's hundreds of colours. What I did specialise in, hopefully still will, is the light green, the original colour. And strangely enough, it's the most.
As long as they don't have long tails.
No, that is probably the most.
He's a bit picky over this. Those of us who like the wild ones.
Yes.
And can we just demystify a little bit? What are new keepers looking for in a budgie? What's going to? We've obviously got this pin-up budgie for the Budgie Society, but I'm looking for a budgie to be a pet. And, what am I looking for?
It's fit and healthy, close feathered, no signs of any diarrhea, no signs of illness, and the feathers close together, not rough. And
because they fluff up their feathers when they're unwell, as Chris said earlier. Yeah.
Okay, and a couple of final questions, and we're done. Our listeners won't be hopefully too happy to hear, but how do we treat common budgie health issues like mites or respiratory infections? Are they common?
well,
Depends on the keeper.
yeah,
I bet you don't have many.
no. Well, if I did have red mite because of the temperature increase. I mean, in 1967. We got, with first year beginner or second year beginner, we got some red mite in the aviary, and my father painted the aviary inside with paraffin, and I could smell it in my bedroom.
Which I should explain is because red mites come out at night, and if you look during the day, for example, at any bird where there's a red mite problem, you will not see the mites.
No.
I would realise that the birds are a bit anemic or pale or itchy or whatever it happens to be, but the mites at night are hiding away.
Yes.
And that's why you've got to stop them having a refuge in the aviary.
Yeah.
And anyone who keeps poultry, I mean, here's an example. Again, the budgie people ought to remember other people get these problems as well. Talk to anyone who has backyard poultry. They have red mite medications. You have
And
them.
British bears and canaries.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's across the board, so it's not some mystery. You don't need to go to the vet for that, but you should keep records so that if it still doesn't work, because red mites can transmit other diseases.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Oh.
they can transmit bacteria and probably protozoal infections. We're still learning about these things. So, so mites should not be a problem, but diagnosis might be. I mean, excuse the pun, a less experienced fancier possibly wouldn't realise why the birds are not
Well,
so good.
if your birds are a bit puff, just check the end of the perches, and you'll find that's where behind the perches, the wooden perches, and in corners. And if you have a big infestation, you can see them all over. Oh, the horrible thing.
And if you've got
ivermectin.
2 final questions.
It's better to prevent mites.
If I can, the stones from the mower.
Yes.
We want to know: were they found in a meadow?
In a meadow. I don't know. We found them in New Zealand. We're shown them in New Zealand.
Oh no, it's just the 2 stones went to mow a meadow.
Oh,
Sorry about that. Final question.
they obviously think they're not up to much. Do you know how long we've been on this blooming podcast?
2 hours, John.
Too long.
And a question like that.
Should we go back for sausages at your house?
I've got some more at my house, yes.
We will.
Final question. And this is not much of a loaded question for you both, really, so tread carefully. Which is the friendliest budgie, male or female?
Female, I think.
Male.
I don't know. I mean,
Well, there you go.
I've kept them.
That's decisive.
They're all friendly.
Well-
they all relate to humans.
I'll tell you now, catching birds, I get bit probably once a month or once every, not often. And the hen bite, it bloody well hurts. And the cock bear, they don't hurt so much.
But I don't want to put people, particularly vets who are getting into this, veterinary students off. I handled a bird today, and you were happy with the way one of your budgies. I'm happy with the way I didn't have gloves on or anything. It attempted to bite me. I mean, compared with big citizen birds, it's nothing.
Well, she was only 4 weeks old.
Exactly. Yeah. But a word of advice to these young vets: if the fancier will think you're strange, put a thin rubber glove on. It's just enough that when the budgie does bite you, it doesn't draw blood.
I remember when I was a schoolboy, I was catching birds. I always put a glove on because obviously I had hands of a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
And I would do it too.
Yeah. So the glove in this case is just that when it does bite. I mean, a vet might want to be looking in the mouth, in which case you should put a little coffee stirrer or something in there so that you can open it up. But if it does get you, it's less painful and less damaging through a glove.
Okay. So I think as we wrap up today's exploration into the fascinating world of budgies, I think it's evident that these delightful creatures require thoughtful care, a suitable environment, and a diet that keeps them thriving. So it's a heartfelt thanks to our guest, Professor John E and Chris Snell, president of the Budgerigar Society, for shedding light on these important topics. And to our listeners, remember, the joy of bird keeping comes with the responsibility of ensuring our feathered friends lead healthy, happy lives. So until the next time, keep soaring towards responsible and informed bird care. This is Naturespace with Haith. I'm Simon King. Thanks for listening.